Alrighty guys, hopping right into it, today we're going to be taking a look at troublemakers. What? No, for real this time, I already did the Monica video. I was saying in my other videos that troublemaker control decks are starting to become a thing, and this first card is actually a really good example of it. The first Discord troublemaker isn't a villain, which is kind of surprising, but there is a Discord villain, and we'll be looking at that later. For right now, we're looking at this one. It's got 6 power, so it's pretty difficult to defeat, especially if you start boosting it up with stuff, and when it's uncovered, each player retires a friend. I'm not a huge fan of this card, number one, because if you're going to be putting it in a troublemaker control deck, like you probably will be, then you're not going to have that many friends to work around with anyway, and you're giving up a lot more than your opponent is in that case. You can't exactly snipe the friend that you want like you can with, say, a lot of pink cards. It has to be your opponent that chooses which card to get rid of, and they can just get rid of the least useful thing on their board. And finally, one of the things that makes the Troublemaker control scene really cool is the fact that your Troublemakers have constant effects that just keep messing with your opponent every single turn. So this isn't really that great of a troublemaker for like a troublemaker control deck, but in regular decks I think it might have a place, so take a look. Now Bab's Seed, that's where it's at. I think this card is awesome. It has power equal to double the power of the opposite character here with the highest power. That is a constant effect that constantly changes. So if your opponent's trying to be clever and they move some ponies over here, and then they give one of their ponies a power boost and try to say that, oh, well, like, you don't take this pony's power because, like, back when I moved them over here, this pony had the highest, but no. Okay, your opponent moves like a 6 power pony over here, this thing has 12 power. That's the trick. Your opponent has to defeat it with low ranking ponies. This is definitely something that can be played around with. One thing people were pretty hyped for is the fact that the main 6 got their own troublemaker cards, and Discord and Queen Chrysalis got their own main card, so it was kind of a flip. We're going to be looking at 4 of the main, and this is the first one I want to look at, obviously. At the start of each player's troublemaker phase, that player retires a resource. I think troublemakers lend themselves a lot to being toolbox cards, so I think having something like this to counter, say, orange and white decks is a pretty cool idea. If you can get a Fluttershy out there, it's got 5 power, it's going to be kind of hard for your opponent to defeat if you are controlling it correctly, and I just think it's a really cool idea to run cards like this to counter certain deck types. Like I was saying before, it's most useful against orange and white. I could maybe see it countering yellow a little bit with like Picnic and stuff, but I just think it's a really cool idea. Not the most useful, but it definitely has its niche. Pinkie Pie is like a ridiculous monster if you can get it out there on the first turn. Oh man. Every time a player draws a card, put a +1 power counter on this card. So that includes drawing a card at the beginning of your turns. If you flip this up and then you draw some cards, maybe you're running like a pink deck and you play something like Let's Get This Party Started or something, or you play DJ Pawn 3 or something, that's, oh my gosh, there's so many possibilities. This thing can get up to like 10 to 12 power within the first few turns. Obviously, the only thing that makes this kind of a tough sell is the fact that blue now has a card that just immediately defeats troublemakers, and this doesn't put any kind of pressure on your opponent's hand or their field or anything. It pretty much just makes it impossible for your opponent to solve that problem until they get rid of this. And every turn they wait, this just gets a little more impossible to beat. Rarity is probably my favorite of the set. She's probably not as good as some of the others, but she's my personal favorite. First of all, she's not worth any points, so even if your opponent does defeat this, they don't get any kind of points advantage or points lead, or really any kind of reward for beating it other than the fact that they can finally start playing the game again. And if they don't defeat it, you can just draw an extra card every single turn. At the start of your troublemaker phase, you may draw a card. Why would that not be good? It's so good. It means you can draw 2 cards a turn instead of just 1, and if your opponent lets us sit out there for like 2 or 3 turns thinking, I can take care of that later, then all of a sudden you have a huge hand advantage over them. One thing troublemaker control decks are going to struggle with a lot is getting the specific card they need at the right time, so any kind of draw we can get is just outstanding. Twilight's the last of the main 6 we're going to look at, and Twilight is interesting. I wouldn't say she's as powerful as Fluttershy or Pinkie Pie, but probably a little more useful than Rarity. Opposing characters at this card's problem lose and can't have colors. So if your opponent has gotten up to solving a problem, like let's say you play this face down on a problem you know your opponent is going to solve, and they actually do move over there and solve it, you flip this up, and all of a sudden your opponent has a really hard time summoning stuff from their hand. For example, if your opponent's playing something like an orange-yellow, and they move their main, and they play a card here to solve that problem, get the bonus, so on and so forth, you flip this up, and those characters do not give any more colors. So your opponent cannot summon anything else unless they have some other stuff on the field. Early game, this is going to be a nightmare. Late game, it's actually really useless, so we'll see what happens with it. Next one we'll look at is Plunder Seed Vines. Plunder Seed Vines is absolute must-have in every Troublemaker control deck. It's not useful in any other kind of deck type, but Troublemaker control deck, we got ourselves a pretty good card. Plunder Seed Vines is a Troublemaker where if it is defeated, which it probably is going to be, it's only got 4 power, you can play another Troublemaker there face up. I really like this card for a couple of reasons. The first reason being, if your opponent does use something like Epic Win to automatically defeat this card, it just becomes an even better Troublemaker. And it doesn't even specify that it can't be a villain, so you could just replace this with a villain, all of a sudden, bad stuff happens. It by itself is a really useless card, but it in a Troublemaker control deck is going to be awesome. Getting on a Spike, actually, you know what, kind of think, but I probably should have put Spike with the mains. It doesn't even matter. Getting onto Spike Excessive, when this card is uncovered, an opponent may pay 2 to dismiss this card. I think this card's really interesting because back in the day I used to run a little card called Timberwolves, and Timberwolves had the effect that when it came into play you had to pay 2. This has 1 more power than that, and it's your opponent that has to pay 2, plus it's not worth any points. I think that's pretty cool. It doesn't really do much, it's kind of just like a big beefy beefcake out there. I think I like Pinkie Pie a little bit more than this card, but this is like an immediate power boost. If you were to play like Plundered Vines and then they defeated it, you could just put Spike down there and it's like, do you have 2 action points left? And they're like, no. And you're like, well, okay then, have fun. And then you just kind of sit behind Spike's big beefy doofus face and your opponent can't really do anything about it for a while. Lastly, we're going to look at a couple of villains. We're going to start with Lord Tirek. I really don't know who this is. I've never really seen him mentioned before, and like before, I don't watch the show, so I'm just going to go off of his card. He's apparently an epic troublemaker, and he's a villain. Lord Tirek is one of the best villains I've seen in a long time. At the start of a face-off involving this card, so pretty much just troublemaker face-offs involving your opponent, they have to discard 1 character they control with the lowest amount of power. Some people are going to argue that, oh, well, all they have to do is discard a pony with like 1 power, like play a pony with 1 power at that problem, and then they have some like discard fodder. But if you're playing around with it correctly, this can be really deadly because you also get a +1 power counter on this card every single time you use that effect. So the first time your opponent fights this, it's at 6. And then the second time your opponent fights it, it's at 7, 8, 9, 10. Just keeps going, and they keep having to get more and more cards out there and get more and more fodder. And eventually this card just becomes completely just impossible to beat. I really think this can be a staple in just about any deck out there, and I want to see what you guys do with it. The last card we'll be looking at is Discord Utter Pandemonium, which is another villain. I'm gonna level with you guys here. I actually don't think this is all that good of a card. I mean, yes, if you combine it with some other stuff, you can make it really good, but on its own, I don't think it's that good. So it's a villain, obviously. Pretty cool. At the start of each player's Troublemaker phase, that player banishes the top card of their deck. I'm pretty sure this just means once, because the rest of the card wouldn't make sense otherwise. While that card remains banished, it has no color requirement, and the player who defeats this Troublemaker may play that card as though it were in that player's hand. Obviously, potential starts to rise. Multicolored decks become really good with this because they don't have to pay attention to color requirements. So if you're running like an element deck where you have all of the different element cards, you could totally make it work with this card. It's got 7 power, so your opponent's going to have a hard time beating it. It's got the villain rule, so that's pretty cool. It's got 1 point, so if your opponent does happen to defeat it, they don't get a huge points boost. Really the main point of this card though is you play it so that you can defeat it. One thing that villain decks are probably going to have to do is they're probably going to have to run blue so that they can defeat their own villains using Epic Win. So if you happen to use this and you happen to banish a really good card, you can use Epic Win, defeat this, and then play that card as though it were in your hand. It's okay. I mean, it's not ultra rare okay, but it's okay. I'm sure somebody's going to find a good use for it, and I'll be really excited to see their deck when they do. And that's pretty much all I have to say on the troublemakers in the set. Overall, it's a decent set of troublemakers. It's not as big as maybe some of the other troublemakers in the other sets, but I'd rather have quality over quantity, just have a few really good troublemakers we can run, than just have a whole bunch of really crappy troublemakers that nobody likes. If you enjoyed this video, please leave it a like. Those things really do help us out. If you have any thoughts on the troublemakers, then leave them in the comments section below, and I'll check them out later. And finally, subscribe to stay up to date on the latest Kudo news. Almost done, guys. I'll see you in part 6.